Namaste, and welcome to this afternoon's Fireside conversation titled Deconstructing Postmodernism with Kushal Mehra. Vichaar Manthan, for those of you who missed yesterday's conference, is an earnest platform to explore and discuss ideas that are relevant to society today. We aim to churn ideas and seek for the truth and explore in a genuine way. I'm delighted today to welcome Kushal Mehra, who is host of the Cārvāka podcast and has a keen interest in postmodernism. Welcome, Kushal.
Namaste, Ravi. Thanks for having me over.
Good to have you. So, Kushal, let's dive straight in. If you could give us a little bit of background about the environment in which postmodernism begins to develop as an idea.
So, Ravi, we're going to have to break it down in, let's say, 3 to 4 segments, right? So I'm going to use, because there's a lot of overlaps from, let's say, authors who started the movement, and there are some certain parallel movements that were running, let's say, in the 1930s. So let's say we'll have to break it down in 3-4 parts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call it part 1 is early postmodernism, which would be somewhere around the 1960s, the early stages.
So if you could just give us a brief overview of that initial early stage and what produces these postmodern ideas. Let's start with a brief summary of that.
So postmodernism to me would be a movement that was started by a bunch of people. Let's say you start with Frederick Jameson, John Baudrillard, and Gutierrez and stuff, people like them, which was focused around the basic premise was questioning the grand narratives of modernity and liberalism, right? So if you were to look at the post-World War II scenario, what you had was Marxism was falling, right? Marxism as an ideology, as a worldview was falling, and there was an intellectual vacuum that needed to be filled. Now, the left is divided into broadly 2 wings, right? One is the liberal wing and one is the Marxist wing. What postmodernism comes in is when, with the fall of Marxism and the rise of liberalism, you have these scholars coming in and you have them questioning what they call the meta-narratives. So, well, now the natural question would be, what are meta-narratives? Meta-narratives are basically ideologies and ideas, or if we were to use a little bit more precise term, memeplexes, set of ideas that are defining societies in general. Now, what postmodernism comes into play is that postmodernism basically questions the sanctity of meta-narratives per se. So let's say Christianity. Now, Christianity is a meta-narrative, right? Even Marxism, for that matter. A classic mistake a lot of people do is they confuse Marxism and postmodernism to be the same. It's actually not. Marxism is...
Is it fair to say that a meta-narrative is a sort of grand story, an overarching story that binds a society or creates a direction for a society to go in?
Yeah, that's what would you call a meta-narrative, a basics framework which is developed in any post-agricultural society, which so you have post-agricultural societies that lead to civilization. And so every civilization, as we say, has a common story, right? So those common stories could be called meta-narratives. So it could be Christianity, it could be Marxism, it could be what they called modernity, for that matter, right? Each and every one of those 3 pillars of Western society was based on a set of meta-narratives. Now, what postmodernism does is it questions those very foundations. So it's very important to understand when we start this discussion that Marxism and postmodernism are actually opposed to each other in many ways. They do meet later on, and we'll discuss where they meet later on. But the point is that in its very beginning, postmodernity and Marxism were actually opposed to each other.
Okay, so let's pick up on this idea. Questioning meta-narratives seems very natural. It seems like questioning is a thing that we should do, and critiquing. Where does this diverge from earnest inquiry into, in our earlier conversation, you sort of referred to it as a destructive idea. So where does it diverge from earnest critique into a more destructive sense?
So again, then we'll have to understand 3 scholars. I believe that these 3 scholars are the key to understanding postmodernity as far as I'm concerned. One would be Lyotard, who basically was the first person who questioned the whole concept of meta-narratives itself. Second would be Derrida, who was, through his work of grammatology, questioned the concept of language and how language is derived, and how do we take language, or how do we conceptualize language itself. And the third would be Foucault with the concept of episteme, power knowledge, discourses, and biopower. So now let's...
Yeah, if I may pick up on that. So we discussed sort of meta-narratives, and Lyotard is, I'm going to stick to that pronunciation for now. Let's pick up on Derrida. So defining your terms is a natural part of every single debate. So where is it that Derrida takes that to an extreme, or what is it that Derrida does that makes this a postmodern idea?
Well, here's the thing with Derrida. Derrida's claim was that language, so we have to work backwards. So what are the postmodern claims? So postmodern claims is that the human being is a blank slate, right? So we are all born blank slates. That means we're born into a condition where basically we are free of ideas, free of influences. And then when we enter this world, so it's like entering into, if we were to use the analogy of sport, we are entering into a field where the rules of the game are preset, right? So let's say if we are playing football, so football has a rules, right? There is a rule of offside, or et cetera, et cetera. If you're playing cricket, like there is a no ball, leg before wicket, etc. These are specific rules. So what postmodernism says is that we are blank slates, but then we enter into societies that have these meta-narratives. What are these meta-narratives? Set ideas with rules and regulations that basically are imposed on us. Now, how are they imposed on us? They are imposed on us through the tool that was language. And language is basically imposed on us through the people who are in power. Now, who decides what is the language, right? So this is where we have to understand. Lyotard says we have meta-narratives. Derrida talks about language, and Foucault talks about the power, right? So what Foucault says is you have to question the whole premise of knowledge itself. Because what is knowledge? So the common understanding of knowledge is what we have kind of come into a common conclusion as. So let's say, well, what most people agree to be true. Now, according to Foucault, that is not good enough, because what most people say that they agree to be true is actually set by people in power who basically have used a certain language. Now, that language could be the language of the meta-narrative of religion, where the truth is the perceived truth from the Messiah of God. It could be in the form of science, where the truth is coming in front, to you in the form of what scientists do and what is called the scientific method. Or the truth could be in the form of Marxism, which is based on the ideology of the class warfare. So what they're saying is that we have to be very skeptical of knowledge itself.
So can you give an example of where Derrida would say, this piece of language contributes to the meta-narrative, contributes to the existing power structure, and it's a language that we should change?
Well, it's very simple, right? Let's take the claim of cultural relativism, right? Let's study cultural relativism. So if we were to say let's say, okay, let's use a very basic example where marriage of girls at the age of 10 or 12, it happens in some cultures, right? And the language and the cultural zeitgeist that we have today in what we call the modern world would say that is something that is objectively bad. Now somebody who's a cultural relativist and a postmodernist would say, oh, but who says it's culturally bad or it's wrong? It is set by those certain people who refine those words through their language, and they are in positions of power. So their power has decided that this is bad. So that's a basic objective example of how language and power work. So the whole premise itself is that everything is relative. There is no such thing as an objective truth. And when I say truth, it's very important to understand here. I don't mean the truth in the sense of of a mathematical truth. The mathematical truths are different, although you have new work coming on which says even mathematical truths are not really true, but that's for some other day. But when we say truth, we mean basic scientific truths like, say, evolution. Now, scientific truths are not 100%. It is basically what is considered to be true under the scientific method is something that has been agreed upon as per the current set of data and current set of experimentations and replications, right? That is considered to be the truth. If new evidence comes up, we'll change our version. But as long as what we know right now, this is considered to be the truth. And that is what we're supposed to be skeptical of. So for a true postmodernist, they would use words like scientism, right? Where it is the language of science which has been imposed on the world, which is basically pushing it down. So what they recommend is, instead of having a meta-narrative, what we should work for is a bunch of mini narratives.
So let's pick up on that. So I can see from what you're saying where movements like defending sort of paedophilia come from intellectually. And what you're saying in the second part is a more sort of Foucault idea of there is no truth and no reality. So then if, let's say I was a postmodernist and I assume that there is no absolute truth or reality, how do I then go about engaging with the world in a constructive way?
So that's a very interesting question. Actually, it's a very good question. So that's what happened with the postmodernists, right? So if you say there is no such thing as the small t truth, right? So you run into a nihilistic trap, right? So if you say there is nothing like a truth, there is no such thing as an objective truth, then, okay, so you're questioning the meta-narratives and you're talking about the mini-narrative. Okay, fair enough. But then why should I believe what you're saying is the truth? You see the problem, right?
What a mini narrative is in the way that you're using it.
So mini narratives would be, let's say, there is a larger cultural narrative right now in the West that says individual rights matter the most. Let's say human rights are something that, so it depends. If you're a right-wing American, you would say they're God-given. If you're a left-wing person, they would assume that these are natural rights. So that's a grand narrative there. That's a meta-narrative that believes we're supposed to treat everyone as an individual. There is a separation of church and state. Then you'll have something like a secular state, right? So these are meta-narratives that are there. Now, within them, there would be mini-narratives. So let's say you would have a community that would say, you know what, I don't believe in the separation of church and state, because under a secular narrative or under a liberal narrative, you would have something like the First Amendment, where freedom of speech is absolute, other than a call to violence, right? The Brandenburg versus Ohio standard. But there would be a mini narrative that would say, according to my religion, you cannot abuse my God. So that's my mini narrative. So the sanctity of free speech itself could be challenged under that mini narrative of that culture.
So mini narrative is localized to an individual set or subset. Now, we were discussing this before, and you brought up the idea that this generates an oppression Olympics. It'd be interesting for you to sort of elucidate how that process happens. How do you go from mini narratives to this oppression Olympics that we're seeing now in the media, where people complain, there's a cancel culture, there's a I feel oppressed culture? How do those two link together?
So before we do that, we'll have to explain what happens with postmodernism. So we have early postmodernism that starts in the 1960s. Then we go into mature postmodernism with Lyotard, Foucault, Derrida. And then what happens is, by the mid to late 1980s, postmodernism runs into a nihilistic trap. And then you run into problems as to how do we get out of this, right? Because eventually, if we question everything, then we can't live our lives. Questioning everything is not a sound strategy. Simultaneously, in the 1970s, if people remember, there was an offshoot of the field of postmodernism, which was called post-colonialism. We have to connect all these dots together to understand what is happening. And then in the 1930s, there was another thing that happened, which was called critical theory. That was started by Herbert Marcuse, Horkheimer, and many other scholars. So that was basically the Frankfurt School. Now, those were, I think, I like to call them disgruntled Marxists, but that's for some other day. So you have critical theory that is coming up. You have post-colonialism that is very much out of postmodernism. So you have post-colonialism, which was started by Edward Said on one side. Edward Said was more inspired by Foucault. But then there are obviously, famous Indian scholars like Homi Bhabha and Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak, right? They were more inspired by Derrida. And they come up with post-colonialism, where they say that whatever the colonialists have said about the ones they colonized should be revisited. And then you have, in the mid 1980s and the late 1980s, you have the introduction of critical race theory and critical legal studies. So this was with the specific idea to take care of the nihilism problem in postmodernism, where they say, okay, we have now given you a positive lens. The funny part is there's nothing positive about it, but at least they can say they have a positive lens.
So they would argue that what they're doing is, for the individual experience and the experience of a nation, they were colonized, suppressed, and they would use the word an inferiority complex was, let's say, placed upon them. So is this not an important process of coming out of that colonized mindset and starting to build your own meta-narrative? So where is it that building of the positive meta-narrative, you said it's not constructive at all. So are they not trying to build their own meta-narrative?
See, here's the thing. You could use Edward Said's tool of post-colonialism, and you could deconstruct Western literature, or you could use Spivak, or you could use many other scholars. There are a few more scholars that have indulged in this. My problem is that when you want to, so the whole claim under post-colonialism was that we are something what they like to call reversing the gaze, right? We're reversing the gaze on the other society. So when you reverse the gaze, the toolkit you use has to be the toolkit available in your own civilizational toolkit. So you can't use postmodernism and say, I'm reversing the gaze. So basically you're using another one of the colonizers' toolkit, and you're basically reversing the gaze. But that's not what I wanted to say. Let's use a very solid example of critical theory or critical race theory, which was introduced in, I think, 1989 by a scholar called Kimberly Crenshaw. Now, if you listen to it, on the face of it, it actually sometimes does sound very sound. So what does intersectionality say? That it's not just one particular point. So I'll give you an example. Let's take the West for an example. So there are two people. There's an African American and there is a Caucasian American, right? So both people have different experiences. And if we were to talk about the Operation Olympics, an African American would score higher in the Operation Olympics card as such than the Caucasian American. Now, I'm willing to buy that. I'm actually willing to concede that because of the history of slavery. You have 400, 500 years of slavery. Definitely, it has a lot of repercussions on their lives. But where I feel intersectionality and postmodernism and critical race theory and all these theories and their mishmash fails is it creates a rigid hierarchy of Operation Olympics. Now, Operation Olympics has to be more flexible, right? If they were flexible, so let's take this as an example. Let's say I'm an African American and I'm a millionaire. And there is some Caucasian who is maybe earning $30,000, $40,000 per annum, and he's living in the rural South. Now, who's more oppressed in that scenario is something that we need to ask very honestly. Is the millionaire African American more oppressed, or is the $30,000 to $40,000 earning Caucasian American oppressed? Now, according to the view that is coming out of critical race theory and postmodernity, is that it just doesn't matter. And here we'll have to introduce the work of scholars like Peggy McIntosh, Barbara Applebaum, and the most famous one these days, which is Robin DiAngelo, right? So let's talk about Barbara Applebaum, which she came up with the complete concept of white complicity, right? So it doesn't matter what happens, every single individual white person is complicit in this crime. What is that crime? This is the crime of slavery. So even if you are not actively indulging in that crime, the remnants of the past are so important that you're complicit no matter what. Now, if you were to question this, so they were questioned, right? Applebaum was questioned. So how did they answer the question? So there comes the concept of Robin DiAngelo, which is of white fragility. So she says that there are three kinds of people, right? So when you say, what is white fragility, is basically you get three kinds of answers, right? When you question someone, or say 4 or 5 kinds of answers, you'll be like, I didn't do it, so why am I it? Why are you telling me? 2, I am opposed to it. And 3, I don't want to talk to you, get the hell out of my way. Or 4, okay, I'm listening, but I don't agree with you. Let's say I'm giving you 3, 4 examples. But what happens is, according to white fragility and the concept that Robin DiAngelo says, is something like this: it doesn't matter, no matter what, you're always at fault.
Yes, so a lot of postmodern ideas are ring-fenced in that way, which prevents discourse. I think we were discussing this before. It prevents open dialogue, which you can draw similarities to certain religions and faith frameworks. If we take the Oppression Olympics and put them to one side for now, as let's say an extreme example that we're seeing manifested, when we met in Mumbai, we sat in the Marriott, we had a coffee. Now, there are people in that society that will not be sitting in the Marriott for 1 generation, 2 generations. So there is some form of social hierarchy. So surely there is something of value in the deconstructing of the lack of societal mobility.
Yeah, I agree with you that there is any society, any post-agricultural society, even hunter-gatherer societies, for that example. I know there is this huge debate in the West, and there are two camps, right? There is the Rousseauian camp and there is the Hobbesian camp. The Hobbesian camp says we keep on getting better and better and better, and they say there is something called the myth of the noble savage, where they say even pre-agricultural societies had some sort of hierarchies, and they also indulge in violence. And then there is the romanticized version, which says no, the Hobbesians are wrong. Pre-agricultural societies were the best, or they were ideal, and okay, it's not about that. But in my view, you don't need postmodernism to realize that societies have hierarchies. You don't need postmodernism to tell you that somebody who's at the lower rank of society, whether it is due to, let's say in the case of my society where I live in, something like caste, right? Caste is a huge problem in India. So we don't need postmodernism to tell us that caste is a problem. I think the problem where postmodernity runs into a trap is that, yes, there are hierarchies in society, but the recognition of hierarchies in society was done by the liberal left too. It didn't need postmodernism. So the issue here is not whether there are hierarchies in society. The issue is, what do we do once we know there are hierarchies in society? I mean, what are the tools that are needed? So let's use India as a classic example. India has the system, what we call in India as reservations, right? What are reservations? There are fixed quotas which are given to people of particular communities, recognizing the historical baggage that we carry as a society, and they are given those quotas in government jobs. Now, that did not need postmodernism. The Indian state came up with the concept of reservations in the 1950s when we formulated our constitution. I mean, the idea of reservations were debated ad nauseum in the Constituent Assembly debates, and we came up with the concept of reservations. I mean, our Constituent Assembly debates were in 1947, 48, 49, 50, 51, that period. And postmodernism as an idea is in 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. So what my problem is that if you say there is no objective truth, then what are we even talking about?
Let's examine that for a moment. So deconstructionism and this sort of tearing down of social hierarchies, what you're saying is they're not exclusively postmodern ideas. They existed pre-postmodernism. So if we go into this idea of, let's go with deconstructionism for now. So that's inherent in modernism. So what is it that postmodernism does that seems to manifest so extremely? I mean, we've touched upon it, but why is it that postmodernists seem to come up with this narrative that the other side cannot engage with?
Well, it's like a religious ideology. So you have to understand, then again, we go into the interplay between conservatism, religious conservatism, and modernity, right? So what was the problem with religious conservatism? Religion had a strict sense of right and wrong, and those rights and wrongs were basically ordained from the clergy, and the clergy would not let you move out. So let's say if a religious text said homosexuality was a sin, then all the homosexuals were banned for life, and you're basically gone. So what modernity did was it challenged that narrative, it challenged those dogmas, and it freed us from those dogmas. Now, the problem with postmodernity is that postmodernity tries to pile on what they call modernity. And what they say is that modernity is not good enough, because even under these modern structures, you still are oppressing people. Now, do they have a minor point? Yes, I think they do. But here's where they go wrong, because postmodernity, again, we go down to the idea, straight back into postmodernity is directly opposed to a concept of something like an objective standard. So if you are a postmodernist, you basically challenge all grand narratives. And if you challenge all grand narratives, you say there is no such thing as good and bad. If there is no such thing as good and bad, then all cultures are equal. And if all cultures are equal, then any society basically has to tolerate horrifying habits. So how do we have a functioning society? Postmodernity talks about creating a functioning society, but if you're going to allow child marriage, if you're going to be allowing witch hunting, if you're going to be allowing those things, how do we build a constructive society? That is the problem. That's what separates both. And that's where postmodernism is very dangerous.
Let's examine that for a moment. So this narrative of postmodernism, then, it seems can really only exist in a society that's done relatively well for itself. In a society where the majority of the populace are struggling to eat or reach any sort of basic stability and wealth, where does the idea of postmodernism sit or flourish at all?
That's actually a very good question. And I think it would lead me to a much larger observation about postmodernity in general. This is my observation. I'm not saying this is the final observation, but this is more to do with why postmodernism exists, not how it came about. To me, religion fell in Western societies, right? So basically, if you look at the ratios, America, I think what is popularly known as nuns, no affiliation to any religion, right? It's around 25 to 28%. I think Europe in general, if you go through the Nordic nations, it runs from 50% to 65%. I don't know about England. I don't have the numbers for England on the back of my hand. Now, religion used to play a very important role in all of these societies. What was that role? It used to give you the glue. It was the bonding of each and every member in society. And modernity and secularism, in a way, came in and smashed the religious edifice. And the mistake that was made by modernity with the rise of neo-atheism, let's say, for example, was that it threw the baby out with the bathwater. Basically, you threw everything out. The whole, they threw the whole kitchen sink, as they say, at it. Now, the collapse of religion and religious structures, what I call loosely bounded religious structures, where I may not be a believer, but I still go to church.
Clarify exactly what they threw out that they shouldn't have thrown out for us.
Well, I think the sense of community. I think the over-obsession with individualism. Let's say, for example, that if I say I'm only an individual unit, that I get it. In the eyes of the government, you should be only an individual unit. And in the government should not look at you from a collectivist perspective. But where the line should have been drawn was that, yes, the government should look at all of us as individuals, but we still are a collective. We still have some common stories and fictions that we all agree upon. Common stories like human rights.
The idea of a community, a culture, a progression together that results in behaviors where sometimes I might sacrifice my own liberty to look after the other. What you're saying is that disappeared.
Yeah. So modernity, so let me connect it again. So modernity did the role of questioning the meta-narrative of religion, and modernity replaced a meta-narrative of religion with a meta-narrative of liberalism. What postmodernity has done is it has basically questioned all meta-narratives, and it is trying to collapse society. Now, when they realized that they have a nihilistic problem, they came up with the concept of white fragility, white complicity, and the oppression Olympics. But you have to understand, you can't live your life based on I suck. Basically, that's what postmodernism says to most people, right? That if you're not in...
How does it say that?
Well, if you're not in the oppression Olympiad, and if you don't qualify for the oppression Olympics, which is basically in a society, postmodernity only recognizes the minority. Minorities by default are not more than 15% of any society, right?
Because the majority is always the oppressor, is what you're saying.
Yes.
Isn't it? Okay.
So if a majority of your society is going to be given a message that you're horrible and you suck, so basically that's a very negative way to live your life, and that is going to end up having deep psychological impacts. To me, postmodernity is basically replacing the role of religion in Western societies. So I'll give you a parallel between them. So if you look at the old religion, right, there was the original sin. What was the original sin in Christianity? The original sin in Christianity was basically Adam and Eve. Eve eats the forbidden fruit, and you have committed the original sin, and mankind is eternally damned. Now, what is the original sin according to a postmodern narrative? The original sin according to the postmodern narrative is your privilege. So if you're a Caucasian in the West, it is your white privilege. If you're someone in India, it's your Brahmin privilege. and it goes to every society according to the Operation Olympics narrative. Now, the difference between the old religion and postmodernity is this. The old religion had redemption. You sinned, but you could still redeem yourself. But in postmodernity, there is no redemption, because Robin DiAngelo says you're fragile, white fragility. So you're always sinned. There is basically no other way. You just have to keep self-flagellating and hating yourself all the time, 24/7, and say you're a horrible person because you're just white or you're just Brahmin.
Well, let's pick up on that. So religion used original sin, and it offered you a way out, a redemption to get rid of that. Now, postmodernism, we discussed in the introduction yesterday that an idea needs money, it needs institutions, it needs people who back it. So postmodernism must serve some agenda, some purpose to survive for as long as it has. So whose agenda or what agenda does it serve?
I think it's filling in a religious gap.
Just on that, so whose agenda does it serve, and how does it offer some form of redemption to further that agenda? Is it saying if you act in this particular way, then it furthers this particular agenda?
So you have to understand, again, the culture in the West has shifted. The old culture of the West was a culture more on individualism and honor, right? So in the good old days, if you had a problem with someone, you would settle it with a one-on-one thing, right? Okay, let's sit down and settle it. As they say, in the good old days, right? It would be a one-on-one thing. We would have a one-on-one debate, or sometimes we lead to, not that I endorse it, fisticuffs, right? So
what was that last bit?
Your fists. It was always one-on-one, right? It was a culture of honor. It was a culture of individualism. It was a culture of what did you do as a person. It has shifted because of postmodernism, and it is, at the end of the day, it is filling that vacuum, that cultural value. Today, the cultural zeitgeist is a culture of victimhood. Am I a victim? Am I oppressed? Everybody is looking to get brownie points on the Oppression Olympiad card, right? So I'm oppressed, you're oppressed, but I'm more oppressed than you are. So everybody's basically going on and on about this. So how did it happen? Obviously, it was funded by a lot of people, but you have to understand that from the 60s and 70s, you had a particular type of ideology that was basically going into the humanities and social sciences. And the biggest difference is that they were never read and they were never critiqued. It's to me, more than the money, it was the lack of critique of their ideologies. Nobody took them seriously, and they just kept on taking place after place after, they just kept on occupying spaces. They kept on churning educational teachers. And now it has become an all-pervasive ideology where teachers have basically indoctrinated so many students that now there is a critical mass that genuinely believes in this culture of victimhood.
So postmodernism exists in arts, literature, culture, and now it's pervading into politics and social life. How ubiquitous is it as an idea? Is it really that big a problem?
Well, it depends on which country you're talking about, right? If you're talking about America, does anybody have a doubt?
From what we're seeing in the news.
Yeah, so what we're seeing in the news. See, it doesn't matter how many people buy the idea. What matters is who buys the idea. It is always remember, culture, I don't believe is not, you have to understand the academia plays a huge role in influencing culture. So what does the academia do? The academia comes up with these concepts. These concepts are then disseminated in the form of different students. These students eventually go and work in creative arts and different fields. So these students carry these ideas into the popular culture, which gets reflected in Hollywood or Bollywood and various other fields. And then it influences the larger society. Obviously, we are complex human beings, and not everybody is going to buy postmodernism. But if we are not to take this seriously, I would say we are committing a grave mistake, because again, I come back to the same problem, that if you say there is no such thing as an objective standard and that everything is relative, then how do we create a society based on rules and regulations then?
Is there a place then for postmodernism in the arts? I mean, postmodernism or postmodern ideas produced bands like Talking Heads, produced artists like Andy Warhol, which people subjectively or objectively enjoy. and it's added value to their lives. So is there a place for postmodernism in the arts? And if there is a place, why does it then not belong in wider society and politics?
Well, as long as, well, wider society and politics has a downstream effect on everything we do in our life. Even in the arts, it depends on which art are you talking about. If you want to show postmodernism in architecture, I'm fine with it. You want to see postmodernism in paintings, I'm fine with it. But again, when you become a postmodernist filmmaker, what are you going to show? You're going to show, again, a particular set of ideas. The issue is not that whether people are oppressed or not. Obviously, people are oppressed. Obviously, there are hierarchies. The issue is, what do we do with them? The issue is, how do we solve those problems? The problem is not the identification of the hierarchies in society. The problem is the solution to those things. The solution cannot be the annihilation of the entire structure of modernity. We cannot say we need to annihilate everything. We need to break the statues down. We need to burn the buildings down. We need to bomb everything away and then rebuild from scratch. Well, show me what you're going to rebuild from scratch. Nobody seems to show it.
Lovely, thank you. So we're getting some interesting comments coming in. So thank you for the audience. Keep them coming in. What I'd like to do, Kushal, is pick up on that idea that you're pointing towards, and let's be constructive. So what ideas are needed to fill the gap that was left when religion as a structure, let's say, collapsed in a major way? And further, what comes after postmodernism? What sort of structures have to be developed after postmodernism?
Well, I think the most amazing example, and which could actually incorporate some elements of pluralism, that postmodernism seems to imply that they believe in pluralism, which I actually disagree. Postmodern philosophy actually at its very core is very rigid. But I think
that point, because that's quite an important point you just made there. So why is pluralism not plural?
Well, if you say that each and every white person is damned forever, then where is the openness in that idea? If you believe there is no such thing as an objective truth, that itself is a truth claim, right? There is no truth itself should be a truth claim. So there is no openness. So I think a beautiful parallel to postmodernism is, I would say, in dharmic philosophy. I think Dharma has a great idea. Let us use Anekantvad of Jainism for an example. So you have the 7 principles of Anekantvad. I don't want to mention the 7 principles here, but you know the classic experiment of an elephant and 5
non-Indian viewers.
So let's say Anekantvad or Syadavad talks about the multiplicity of viewpoints. So yes. What does so if we were to apply Anekantvad not just in logical thinking, but we can apply Anekantvad in morality, in ethics, and many other things, right? For example, so let's say, what does Anekantvad say? Anekantvad says that they use the classic example of the elephant and the 5 men. So 5 men with the the blinded men, right? So I might touch the trunk, somebody might touch the tail, somebody might touch the leg, somebody might touch the body, and we'll all have our own perspective on what the elephant is. So what Anekantvad is trying to teach us is that there is a multiplicity of viewpoints. There is a plurality of viewpoints. Now, if we were to use this in the realm of socio-cultural political ethics, we could say we need to incorporate more views. We need to incorporate the subaltern view. We need to incorporate the Savarna view. We need to incorporate the Caucasian view. We need to incorporate the African-American view. And we need to give them equal amount of weightage, or in many cases, more weightage where the truth exists. Now, here's the difference between the plurality of Anekantvad and the rigidity of postmodernism. While Anekantvad preaches plurality and openness, it does not say there is no such thing as an objective truth. It categorically states that, yes, there is a truth, but we can reach it through multiplicities. We can reach it through the plurality. So that's where I believe postmodernism fails, because Anekantvad says there is a truth, and postmodernism says there is no such thing as a truth. So if you take there is no such thing as an objective standard into ethical thinking, then child marriages are fine. Then maybe female genital mutilation is fine. Then maybe, I don't know how how deep down the rabbit hole do you want me to go? But if we say there are objective standards, then you can say, no, child marriages are not fine. Maybe it was 1,000 years ago. They're not fine today. Maybe, go ahead.
It seems what you're saying is postmodernism as an idea has a certain appeal to it. It's very seductive for me to fall into this victimhood mindset, and it sort of erodes the idea of an expert in society, and therefore my opinion becomes as valid as the others. If we're going to continue looking to the future, you mentioned pluralism or plurality, and this sort of seeking for the truth. What would you say would be the key sort of tenets that we have to build any sort of future for a society on? If you could sum up in three.
I always say that I can't speak for the rest of the world, but I definitely have my views for Indian society. I think we are one of the oldest living civilizations, and we have a continuing civilization of thousands of years. And now I believe these are the three principles that our civilization always believed in. One is mutual respect, not tolerance. Mutual respect. I respect you and you respect me. The second is reciprocity. We have to bring in mutual respect with reciprocity. It's not good enough that I believe in mutual respect. You have to reciprocate it. It's not good that I believe in mutual respect, but you'll be like, okay, I'm fine with tolerance. I'll give you tolerance in return of your mutual respect. That's not good enough. You have to give me mutual respect in return of mutual respect. And the third would be, which I call the idea of Krishna's ahimsa. Krishna's ahimsa would be, to use modern war terminology, a no first strike attitude, right? So if you attack me, I have every right to defend myself, but I will never go out of my way and attack you. I think if the world would follow these ideologies, there are many other things that we can use from various other ideologies. Let's say the harm principle from Mill, and there are various other philosophical concepts. But if we were to follow these things, I think we could live a far more positive life than, let's say, what we get from postmodernism.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm conscious of time. So in 2 minutes, the two questions I'd like you to answer is, what one thing would you request someone who sort of believes in postmodern, describes himself as a postmodernist, what's the one thing you would like to say to them? And the second one is, going forwards, by what criteria do we judge a good idea? Those two things in 2 minutes, please.
Well, if I was to meet a postmodernist, I will always tell them that if you believe there is no such thing as an objective truth, then do you think that societies where women are oppressed, who are of different cultures, they don't need to be saved? That's a very simple question. Okay. And what was your second question? I forgot.
The second one is, by which criteria should we judge whether an idea is good or sustainable?
If it violates the harm principle, the idea is not good. If it does not violate the harm principle, the idea is excellent.
Okay, so any idea that results in minimum harm is sort of sustainable and good. Thank you very much. A really insightful discussion. I think we explored quite a few nooks and crannies of postmodernism, and we've signposted towards possibly where its structure falls down, and also look towards the future of where we as a human society, as a global species, need to be looking to build our next great civilizations. Now, thank you very much for joining us, Kushal. Before I wrap up, I'd like to thank the audience for joining us. We've had some brilliant comments coming in, and we'll share them with our speaker, Kushal, after this. After this fireside, this afternoon, this evening, we have at 6 o'clock, British Standard Time, a Vichaar Manthan titled Institutionalizing Religion, Can It Be Sustainable? We'll be joined by Acharya Vidyabhashkar, Amer Burke, and Reverend Peter Groves, which will be chaired by Anil Astana. So do tune in for that. The link is in the YouTube description below. After that, today at 8:30 British time, we've got a further fireside titled Agrinomics by Eric Lonergan, who's a leading economist and regularly appears on Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kushal. And we look forward to seeing you all in our future events.